Greetings, everybody. In this part of the lecture, we're going to be looking at this prompt right here. Discuss the background of when, how, and why Jamestown was founded. Be sure to discuss the challenges and success the early settlers faced during the first few years. Be sure to provide specific examples from the lecture. So by that, you want to look at what is written in the text for the lecture and some of the videos that are provided to further expand on this particular prompt here. And then notice that there's another prompt, another part of the lecture. From your notes, you're going to construct a 5 to 6 paragraph essay to respond to the entire essay prompt, which I'll show you in just a little bit. And that essay prompt will be what might be randomly selected during one of your exams coming up this semester. So the first thing we want to kind of point out about slavery in colonial America, British America, as it began to develop in the mid-1600s and really became institutionalized by 1700, is that it's a profound paradox, quite obviously, right? This is the thing that's most disturbing about studying American history, is that we have this institution, this horrid institution that is really a stain on the American narrative, and at the same time, this concept of freedom is also developing. This concept of liberty, of justice, of individuality is also developing in the colonies. And that's something to keep in mind, that this is a new concept that humanity is adapting, that in large part, is developing in this part of the world. So part of this lecture series is really expanding on this thing called the American paradox. And some of the things you want to keep in mind is, why did the founding fathers like Jefferson, Mason, Henry, who were so outspoken on their denunciation of slavery, nevertheless own hundreds of slaves? You know, as the question is were they hypocrites? Thomas Jefferson wrote a document, the Declaration of Independence, that argued, and it is an argument, that all men are created equal, yet he owned up to about 300 slaves during his lifetime. So was he a hypocrite, or were there some relatively valid reasons? And when I say valid, I don't mean that there were reasons that justified it. Mainly there were other reasons you could point out for the obvious conflict between their words and their deeds. So I want you to kind of chew on that. That's as we're going through the material. That's really an open-ended question right now that might be useful in responding to the discussion in week 2, I believe it is. Okay, let's move on. So first thing we want to understand is that Jamestown, it was first chartered in 1606. And the thing we want to really be clear about Jamestown is that in the English enterprise into establishing colonies and beginning its empire overseas, is that England was Johnny-come-lately in this game of empire. The Portuguese, the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, had all played a big part in colonizing the New World and other parts of the world. England was dealing with a lot of internal struggles going on in its country, religious strife, economic strife, and a whole host of other things that were slowing it down as far as empire is concerned. And so the great irony of England getting into the game of colonization late is that they do become the most powerful empire in the world, mainly from the late 1700s, 1760s, all the way up to the early 1900s, World War I precisely. So just keep that in mind as we're going through this. But nevertheless, Jamestown, the charter is founded in 1606. The settlers arrive in 1607. Trouble starts as soon as they begin to settle. It starts in 1608. and continues through 1624. Most of the trouble is going to occur between 1608 and 1610, where it looked like it was going to fail. And I'll get into details in this in a little bit, but it was based mainly on poor geography, and the settlers not prepared, and poor leadership as well. So looking at the map right here, this is where they are. Oops, let's go here. There we go. This is where they're settling, right here in Jamestown. They settle right there in the Chesapeake. This is the first settlement of Jamestown, this illustrated picture of it. What they're settling on is not conducive really to a long-term settlement. We have to understand why these people were here at first. These people are here not to settle for the long term. They are here to capture slaves, perhaps, to find gold like their counterparts had been doing for so many years, the Portuguese and the Spanish, and getting rich quickly and returning home to the motherland. The problem that they face is twofold. The Native Americans in this area know about Europeans, and so they're ready for them. They've heard lots of stories of the Portuguese and the Spanish and the Dutch before the English getting there, so they're on the defense and ready for them. And also the other problem is that they are going into a place where there is no gold. So this is going to have a pretty hard detrimental effect on early settlement. By 1609, 1610, a lot of these people are starving in a harsh winter and resulting to cannibalism. They're sort of put back on track by 1611 with John Smith returning to the colony after basically running away and living with the Powhatan Indians and having that little story with Pocahontas. He comes back, puts in the edict of those that do not work, do not eat, that kind of a thing. Things are sort of put on track. I think I want to keep the other thing that begins to put this settlement on track is John Rolfe, who eventually marries Pocahontas, grows the first successful commercial tobacco crop, and this is going to become the impetus for this colony. Again, originally it was for basically finding gold like any other colony used to be in the Americas, mainly with the Spanish and the Portuguese, but tobacco is going to become the impetus for this colony. And then they are to establish themselves. You know, Virginia is very far away from Great Britain, and they are beginning to establish wealth by 1619. And so the settlers of Jamestown, being the landed elite, find what is called the House of Burgesses. The House of Burgesses is the first democratic assembly in the Americas, very significant as far as the concept of salutary neglect, in which we'll get into in the next lecture. It's just basically the colonists beginning to govern themselves outside of the influence of Great Britain. The other thing to keep in mind, too, is that in 1619 you do have the first Africans shipped to a British colony. It's unclear if they were slaves or indentured servants. They probably were indentured servants. The word slavery wasn't as defined as it will become. So, just to give you an overview of how tobacco really takes root in Virginia, in 1618, Virginia produced about 20,000 pounds of tobacco. By 1622, despite losing nearly 1/3 of its colonies in an Indian attack, Virginians produced about 60,000 pounds of tobacco. Just 5 years later, in 1627, Virginia is producing 500,000 pounds of tobacco. And a couple years later, we're moving into Virginia producing about 1.5 million pounds of tobacco. So what's a couple of things to keep in mind? One, tobacco is everything that Virginia is going to be. It's going to shape everything about Virginia. And it also demonstrates that we are in a boom-bust economy here. So if you look at this line here demonstrates anything above this line demonstrates profits. Anything below this line demonstrates loss of profits. So the first couple of years, 1618 through even 1630, even though the line's dropping quite a bit, profits are up. You have a kind of a high peak up here, never getting back to up here as it was in 1618, but nevertheless profits are maintaining. It is not until we get to about the 1650s that we begin to see a dip in profits. Right, a little bit of a spike above where we're seeing profits, but as we get into, and take note of this, the 1660s, 1670s, profits go below the line of where they are at cost. In other words, tobacco farmers are not producing profits on average. Some are, but on average, most are not. So basically, this is just the dynamic of any capitalist market. At first, you have a few people who get in the market early on, they make a bunch of money, and everybody jumps on board, and the price plummets, right? Keep this in mind. We're going to get into this in the next learning objective, in the next video on this. This has a lot to do why West Africans were going to be used as the labor force, and slavery is going to be institutionalized. Right, the first impotence of slavery were indentured servants. Right, these were people that would sell their labor for anywhere from 3 to 5 to 7 years, and from there they would become free. That is slowly going to give way to African-based slavery, that would be imposed for life. And slavery that would create an identity in colonial America based on white identity, right? White supremacy. So keep that in mind. This is a real important factor in how slavery develops. But we'll talk more about that in the next video. So take care, and do get me on Selly if you have any questions. Bye.
My soul arise in heaven, Lord, for you in Jordan roll. Everybody say, roll, Jordan, roll. Roll, Jordan, roll. My soul arise in heaven, Lord, for the year when Jordan roll. Roll, Jordan, roll. Roll, Jordan, roll. My soul arise in heaven, Lord, for the year when Jordan roll. Roll, Jordan, roll. Roll, Jordan, roll. My soul arise in heaven, Lord, for the year when Jordan roll.